In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this modal completely from scratch. Let's get started. So to get started, I'm opening up an empty CodePen project. At the top of the HTML, I just have a head tag with a link to the font family I'm going to use for this project, and then beneath that I have body tags which are empty. So in this video tutorial, I'm going to go over all of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to make this welcome modal. So to begin, I'm going to jump inside of the body tags of the HTML. And to get started, first I'm just going to include some content on the page, so that way when the user initially lands on the document, they actually see something. So I'm just going to include an H1, and it's just going to say dashboard view. This is just placeholder content for this demonstration. So when the user initially lands, they're going to see this text, and after a certain number of seconds, I want that modal to appear. So beneath this, I'm going to create a div with a class and ID of modal, which will hold the entire modal design. And within this element, I'm going to have a div with a class of modal container that will hold all the text for this element. So for this modal container, I'm going to include an H1 element with the text of welcome, and then I'm going to include a paragraph tag with some other text. So beneath these elements, I'm going to contain two buttons, which will allow the user to either start the tutorial or skip it. So I'm going to create a div with a class of modal buttons that will hold both of these buttons. And first, I'm going to add a button with a class of button secondary because it's going to have the secondary button style. I'm also going to give it an ID of modal skip because it will allow the user to skip the tutorial, and I'm just going to add the content of skip. The second button, I'm going to give it a class of button primary because it is going to have the primary treatment, and I'm just going to have it say start tutorial. So this is actually all of the HTML that we need for the project, and everything else will be completed within CSS and within JavaScript. So to get started, first I'm going to jump inside of the CSS. Now I added SCSS as a preprocessor here, which allows me to be really organized with my CSS code and also declare variables. So if this is brand new to you and you're using CodePen, you can click on this little gear icon, and under CSS preprocessor, you can add it here to your project. If not, you can just use regular CSS. So first, I'm just going to copy and paste some color variables for the project. And beneath that, I'm going to add the basic styling that I add to every project. I'm just going to set the box sizing set to border box and a margin and padding set to 0 universally. So then underneath that, I can actually start applying styling for the project. So first, I'm just going to reference the body. And I'm going to set the font family to the family that I referenced in the header of the HTML. I'm going to set the color of the text to a particular color. And for the landing state, I want that dashboard view text to be in the center of the page. So I'm just going to set the display of it to flex and then place items in the center. And I'm also just going to set the height of it to 100% of the viewport height. So now we can see that the content is in the center of the page, but we have to do a little bit of work to make this behave like an actual modal. Right now it appears as if all of this content is just on the page, but I want this dashboard view to be the element on the page, and I want this to be a box that goes on top of the dashboard view. So beneath this, I'm going to reference the class of modal, which again holds the entire modal element. And first, I'm going to set the width and the height to 100%, and I'm also going to set a background color to 50% black. The reason why I'm doing this is to add an overlay, so that way the modal stands out even more. Now, I want this overlay to be on top of the entire screen. So the way I'm going to do that is by setting the position of the modal to absolute, and then I'm going to set a top and left to 0, so that way it will start at this area. So now we can see that the overlay is on top of the entire page. For the actual modal, I'm also going to set the display of it to flex with a place item set to center. And initially, I don't want this modal to be interactive at all, so I'm going to set the pointer events to none. So beneath this, I'm going to apply styling for the actual container, which holds the text for the modal. So here I'm writing and container. And I'm going to set the background color to white. I'm going to specify the width to 26 rem. I'm going to add a little bit of padding, and I'm also going to add a border radius. So now we can see that styling on the page. Next, I'm going to apply styling for this header. I'm just going to set the H1 to text align center. Next, I'm going to apply styling for the paragraph tag. So here I'm going to reference the paragraph. I'm going to set the line height to 1.5 rem, so it's a little bit more condensed. I want there to be a line between the header and the paragraph, so I'm going to add a border top, 1 pixel solid and a light gray. And I'm also going to add some padding of the top and bottom of 1 rem. Next, I'm going to work on the buttons. So beneath this, I'm going to write and buttons, which represents the container that holds those buttons. I'm going to set a margin top to 1 rem. I'm going to set the display of this to flex with a gap of 0.5 rem, and I'm going to justify content by setting it to flex end. So now these buttons are pushed towards the right side of the modal. Next, I'm going to work on the styling of these buttons. Now, because I'm going to use buttons throughout this project, I'm just going to have it outside of this entire modal element because I don't want these buttons to only have this styling within this modal class. So completely outside of it, I'm going to reference the button element. And for the buttons, I'm going to set the font family to inherit. I'm going to set the padding top and bottom of 0.4 rem left and right to 8 rem. I'm going to set the outline to none, the font size to 1 rem, and the cursor to pointer. And I'm going to add a border and a border radius. Next, I'm going to work on the styling for the primary button and the secondary button. So beneath this, I'm going to reference the class of button primary. And for this button, I want it to stand out a bit more from the background. So I'm going to add a background color, which will be the primary color. And then I'm going to modify the color of the text. And for the secondary button style, I'm going to set the background color to transparent, and I'm going to set the color of the text to the primary color. So that way this button style has a different treatment. So now we have this entire modal completely designed. So this is looking really good so far, but this modal actually isn't in the center of the page like I want it to be. So instead of saying place items, I'm going to justify the content and align the items in the center. And I'm also going to do the same thing for the dashboard view behind it. So now everything is center aligned. Now, initially, I don't want that overlay or that modal to be visible. When the user lands on the page, I only want them to see the dashboard view, and then after a few seconds, I want that modal to appear. So underneath this modal element, I'm going to initially set the opacity to 0, so that way it's not visible on the page at all. And I'm going to want it to transition in, so I'm going to add a transition of 250 milliseconds of the opacity property with an ease in. So now the overlay and the modal are not visible at all. So the next thing I have to do is actually create a class that will make that modal visible on the page. So beneath this, I'm going to write and visible, which will be a class that we will add to the modal to make it visible on the page. And for this, I'm going to set the opacity to 1, so that way it becomes visible again. And I'm going to set the pointer events to auto, so that way the buttons will actually be clickable. So once I add this class, we don't see a difference in the actual view, and that's because we haven't assigned this class anywhere yet. So the last thing I need to do is actually jump inside of the JavaScript to start applying functionality here. So the first thing I like to do is actually declare variables for the elements in the HTML. So I'm going to create a variable for the modal, and I'm going to create a variable for the modal skip button. So I'm just referencing the ID of these elements from the HTML. And the next thing I'm going to do is pay attention to when the window loads. And so when the window loads, I want there to be a few seconds delay, and then I want that modal to become visible. So here I'm going to write window.onload, and when that event occurs, I'm going to run a function, and the function will be a set timeout function, so I'm going to write set timeout. And so when the window loads, I'm going to start this set timeout. And for this function, what do I want to happen? Well, I want the modal to add the class of modal visible. So here I'm writing modal.classlist.add. And I'm going to add the class of modal visible. And with set timeout, you can indicate how long you want the element to wait before the function runs. So here I'm going to add a comma and then write 2000, which represents 2000 milliseconds. So this is basically saying when the window loads, start this set timeout, which will add the class of modal visible, and it will take place 2 seconds after the window loads. Great, so now we can actually see that effect in the document. Now we have these two buttons here. Start tutorial would actually begin the tutorial sequence, which I haven't designed yet, but this skip button would dismiss the modal, so I'm just going to add functionality for this button. So beneath this, I'm going to reference that skip button, which I defined as button skip here. So I'm going to write button skip. I'm going to add an event listener. I'm going to pay attention for a click. And when this button is clicked, I'm going to remove the class of modal visible. So now when the page loads, it waits a few seconds, then the modal becomes visible. And if I click skip, it should dismiss it. And when I do, it goes away. So there you go. That's how I created this modal completely from scratch. Please let me know if you have any questions on the topic and subscribe to stay up to date with my latest content. Thanks for watching.